On January 23, 1915, a Baptist preacher named John Chilembwe stood before his congregation in a small brick church in the village of Mbambwe and told them something remarkable. He told them they were probably going to die. Not someday, not eventually, but soon, within days, because of what they were about to do. And then he asked them to follow him anyway. The story of John Chilembwe doesn't fit neatly into the categories we usually use when we talk about colonialism and resistance. He wasn't a traditional chief fighting to preserve ancient ways. He was educated in America, ordained as a Baptist minister, and for years he worked within the colonial system, building schools and churches, preaching hard work and self-improvement. But something changed. By 1915, this gentle preacher who had once cared for a sick British child with such tenderness that she never forgot his kindness had become a revolutionary. Understanding that transformation means understanding what British colonialism actually looked like on the ground in a place called Nyasaland, what it did to people's bodies and spirits, and what it takes to make someone decide that even a doomed rebellion is better than continued submission. John Chilembwe was born around June 1871 in Sangano, in what would become the Chiradzulu district of British Central Africa. His father was Yao, his mother was Manganja, and, according to some accounts, she had been captured in warfare and enslaved. This mixed heritage mattered, because it placed Chilembwe at the intersection of two groups whose histories had been violently disrupted. The Yao had originally come from northern Mozambique, fleeing famine, and many had become middlemen in the Arab slave trade that devastated the region. The Manganja were the traditional inhabitants of the area, and they were often the ones being enslaved. Chilembwe grew up in what one historian called an atmosphere of insecurity, in a region where intertribal warfare and the slave trade created constant violence and displacement. When the British colonized the area in 1891, calling it British Central Africa and later renaming it Nyasaland, they claimed they were bringing civilization and commerce, ending the slave trade and establishing order. The reality was more complicated. British control rested on military superiority, and during the 1890s, colonial authorities suppressed numerous rebellions by the local Yao, Ngoni, and Chewa peoples. What the British called pacification, others might call conquest. The British established missions throughout the region, and around 1890, Chilembwe attended a Church of Scotland mission school at Blantyre, a town itself named after the birthplace of the famous missionary and explorer David Livingstone. In 1892, when Chilembwe was in his early 20s, he became a house servant for a British missionary named Joseph Booth. This encounter changed his life. Booth was not your typical colonial missionary. He had arrived in Africa that same year as a Baptist, intending to establish the Zambezi Industrial Mission near Blantyre, and he was immediately critical of the Scottish Presbyterian missions for their reluctance to admit black Africans as full church members. Booth held radical views about racial equality that alarmed both other missionaries and colonial officials. He believed that Africans and Europeans should worship as equals, and he would eventually publish a manifesto titled Africa for the Africans, calling on the British Crown to cede African land back to Africans and treat them as equals. Chilembwe quickly became more than just Booth's servant. He became his interpreter, his student, and his trusted companion. Booth's daughter Emily later recalled how when she fell sick with malaria and her father was away on mission business, Chilembwe cared for her with extraordinary tenderness despite speaking little English. His compassion and gentleness left a lasting impression. Booth recognized Chilembwe's intelligence and his hunger for education, and over the next 5 years, Chilembwe absorbed not just literacy and Christianity, but ideas about human dignity and racial equality that would shape the rest of his life. In 1897, Booth and Chilembwe traveled together to Britain and then to the United States. Booth was trying to raise money for his missions, and he wanted Chilembwe to receive formal theological education. But traveling together as equals in America proved difficult because of racial discrimination, and the two men eventually separated. Booth introduced Chilembwe to the Reverend Lewis Gordon, the Foreign Missions Secretary of the National Baptist Convention, and arrangements were made for Chilembwe to attend the Virginia Theological Seminary and College in Lynchburg, Virginia. Chilembwe arrived in Lynchburg in 1898, and the city was experiencing an economic boom. The Virginia Theological Seminary had been founded in 1886 and had only recently begun admitting black students. The seminary's president was a man named Gregory Hayes, a radical African-American activist who believed passionately in self-help and black advancement as ways to overcome oppression. At the seminary, Chilembwe studied alongside other students including Anne Spencer, who would become a famous poet and civil rights activist. The curriculum exposed him to ideas that were circulating in African-American intellectual circles at the turn of the 20th century. Ideas about racial pride, self-determination, and resistance to white supremacy. During his time in America, Chilembwe encountered the works and ideas of major black thinkers like Booker T. Washington, who emphasized education and economic self-sufficiency, Frederick Douglass, who had escaped slavery and become a powerful voice for abolition, and, most significantly, John Brown, the white abolitionist who had attempted an armed rebellion against slavery at Harper's Ferry in 1859 and was hanged for it. Chilembwe also met John L. Dube, a Zulu missionary from South Africa, and other radical preachers who were highly critical of white racism and colonial oppression. He joined the seminary's African Development Society, which worked to establish missions and economic projects in Central Africa. The experience gave Chilembwe what one historian called an increasingly global perspective on the struggle of people of African descent against injustice and white supremacy. Chilembwe was ordained as a Baptist minister in Lynchburg in 1899. When he completed his studies in 1900, he returned to Nyasaland with the blessing of the Foreign Missions Board of the National Baptist Convention, and with promises of financial support from African American Baptists. He was 29 years old, educated, ordained, and full of ambitious plans for his people. Upon his return, Chilembwe founded the Providence Industrial Mission in the village of Mbambwe, near Chiradzulu, just a few miles from where he had grown up. The mission was modeled after the ideas he had encountered in America, particularly Booker T. Washington's emphasis on practical education and economic development. With assistance from the National Baptist Convention, Chilembwe established a chain of independent African schools that eventually enrolled over 900 pupils. He built an impressive brick church that became a landmark in the region. He founded the Natives' Industrial Union, which one historian described as an embryo chamber of commerce to help Africans improve their economic situation. He planted cotton, tea, and coffee, trying to show that Africans could be successful commercial farmers. For the first 12 years after his return, Chilembwe was considered a model of nonviolent African advancement by colonial authorities. His main message was African self-respect and progress through Christianity education, hard work, and personal responsibility. White Protestant missionaries initially supported his activities, though his relations with Catholic missions were less friendly. He preached against drunkenness, encouraged people to work hard, and taught children and adults alike. People who knew him during this period described him as someone who wanted his fellow Africans to be industrious and to carry themselves with pride, like the successful Black Americans he had seen in Virginia. But Chilembwe's mission existed in the shadow of something that would gradually transform his perspective. Just a few miles from his church at Mbombwe was an estate called Magomero, part of the holdings of a company called A.L. Bruce Estates, one of the three largest agricultural landowners in colonial Nyasaland. The Bruce family's connection to the region went back to David Livingstone himself. Alexander Lowe Bruce had married Agnes Livingstone, David Livingstone's daughter, in 1875. Though Alexander Lowe Bruce never visited Nyasaland, he obtained title to some 170,000 acres of land there, largely through his association with the African Lakes Company. When he died in 1893, the land passed to a trust for his sons, David Livingstone Bruce and Alexander Livingstone Bruce. The estate at Magomero, which comprised 162,000 acres, was named after a village that David Livingstone had recorded during his Zambezi expedition. The family's claim to this vast territory was based on treaties and land sales that most Africans had little understanding of, and certainly never agreed to in any meaningful sense. In 1893, the trust appointed a manager for Magomero, a Scottish man named William Jervis Livingstone from the Isle of Lismore. He was 28 years old when he took the job, and he would hold it for 21 years until his death. The estate experimented with various crops, trying first to grow coffee, then cotton, then tobacco, searching for something profitable. Cotton proved most promising, especially after 1906 when Livingstone developed a hardier variety called Nyasaland Upland. By 1914, 5,000 acres at Magomero were planted with cotton. Growing cotton required intensive labor throughout its 5 or 6 month growing season. To ensure that 3,000 to 5,000 workers were available, the estate exploited something called the Thangata system. Thangata was originally an African word meaning help, the kind of reciprocal assistance neighbors might give each other. Under colonial rule, it became something entirely different. It meant the labor that African tenants on European-owned estates had to provide in lieu of rent. Tenants were also required to work additional time to cover the hut tax that the estate owner paid on their behalf. Alexander Livingstone Bruce, who moved to Nyasaland in 1908 and took control of estate operations, instructed his manager William Jervis Livingstone to exploit Thangata rigorously to maximize cotton production. The labor demands increased to 4 or 5 months per year, concentrated during the rainy season, which was also the main growing season for food crops. This left tenants with little time to grow their own food. Previously, widows and unmarried women had been exempted from labor requirements, but now they too were required to work. Workers were often not paid in cash, or paid poorly, or given tobacco instead of money. Beating and whipping were common. The obligations were based on verbal contracts that gave tenants no real ability to dispute the estate's interpretations. After the uprising, a commission of enquiry would hear testimony about conditions at Magomero, and find that they were illegal and oppressive. But in the years before 1915, these conditions were simply the reality that thousands of people lived with, many of them members of Chilembwe's congregation. Chilembwe watched what was happening at Magomero and the other European estates. He saw the Thangata system in operation. He saw people forced to work for months at a time for little or no pay, while the land that should have fed their families instead produced cotton for export and profit for Europeans. He began to speak out. His activities created friction with the managers of the Bruce estates, who feared his influence over their workers. Chilembwe built churches and schools, including some on estate land, places where people could gather and learn and perhaps think about their situation in new ways. In November 1913, employees of the A.L. Bruce Estates, acting on orders from William Jervis Livingstone, burned down churches that Chilembwe or his followers had built on estate property. This was a direct attack on his work, a violent assertion that educated Africans had no place in this colonial society. Alexander Livingstone Bruce made no secret of his views. He believed that educated Africans were dangerous, that the only proper relationship between Europeans and Africans was master and servant, and he personally disliked Chilembwe precisely because Chilembwe was educated and refused to accept that subordinate role. The destruction of his churches was deeply personal for Chilembwe, but it was also symbolic of something larger. For over a decade, he had worked within the colonial system, trying to improve African lives through education and economic development. But the system kept pushing back. European planters accused him of fomenting nationalism. The colonial authorities viewed his independent African churches with suspicion, and all around him, the exploitation continued. Then came 1914 and the outbreak of the First World War in Europe. By September, the war had spread to Africa as British and Belgian forces began fighting against German colonial forces in East Africa. The major effect in Nyasaland was massive recruitment of Africans to serve as porters, carrying supplies for Allied troops. Men were conscripted in large numbers, sometimes through threats against chiefs who were told they would be removed from office if they failed to produce enough men. Recruiters often used violence. Chiefs and elders who witnessed these practices later described them as resembling slavery, the very thing colonialism was supposed to have ended. By 1917, recruiting parties would raid villages at night, going house to house and capturing any adult males they found. African casualties mounted quickly. In September 1914, there was a battle at Karonga in northern Nyasaland that resulted in heavy African losses. For Chilembwe, who had preached pacifism and who saw his congregation shrinking as men were forcibly recruited, this was intolerable. In times of peace, Africans were denied education, denied land rights, denied any meaningful voice in governance. Everything was for Europeans only. But in time of war, suddenly Africans were needed to fight and die. They were expected to share the hardships and shed their blood in equality for a cause that was not theirs, for a system that treated them as subhuman. In November 1914, Chilembwe wrote a letter to the Nyasaland Times newspaper in Blantyre. It was a passionate protest against African conscription. He wrote that Africans had been told they had nothing to do with the civilized world, but now they were being plunged into the Great War. He pointed out the bitter contradiction. Let the rich men, the bankers, the titled men, the storekeepers, the farmers, and landlords go to war and get shot, he wrote. Instead, we, the poor Africans who have nothing to own in this present world, who in death leave only a long line of widows and orphans in utter want and dire distress, are invited to die for a cause which is not theirs. The colonial authorities censored the letter. The wartime censor prevented its publication. By December 1914, Chilembwe was regarded with deep suspicion by the colonial government. Officials began planning to deport him and some of his followers to Mauritius. Whether Chilembwe learned of these deportation plans isn't certain, but the censoring of his letter seems to have been a turning point. If peaceful protest was impossible, if even writing a letter to a newspaper was forbidden, then what options remained? By the end of 1914, Chilembwe had made his decision. He began detailed organization for rebellion. He gathered a small group of educated Africans, men who had been trained either at the Blantyre Mission or at the schools of independent African churches in the region. His close lieutenants included people like David Kaduya, a former soldier in the King's African Rifles. Chilembwe also formed close ties with Filippo Chinyama in Ncheyu, about 110 miles to the northwest, who assured him that he would mobilize his followers to join the rebellion when it began. In a series of meetings in December and early January, Chilembwe and his followers discussed their plans. What exactly Chilembwe hoped to achieve remains unclear, because he and most of his chief collaborators were killed shortly after the uprising failed, and many documents were destroyed in a fire in 1919. Some historians believe he planned to establish an independent African state in the Shire Highlands region, or perhaps throughout Nyasaland, though what that state would look like was never defined. Others suggest he knew the rebellion would fail, but wanted to make a symbolic protest, to strike a blow and die, drawing attention to African suffering under colonialism in a way that peaceful methods never could. The phrase, "strike a blow and die," was reportedly something Chilembwe said multiple times, though this comes from accounts written years later and may not be entirely reliable. By mid-January, Chilembwe was ready. He had acquired a military textbook and organized his followers. The plan had 3 parts. One group would attack Magomero, the headquarters of the Bruce Estates, targeting the plantation's European managers. Another contingent would attack Blantyre and Limbe, where most white settlers lived, and attempt to seize weapons stored by the African Lakes Corporation. A third element involved Chinyama's followers from Ncheyu moving south to join the uprising. Chilembwe also sent a message to German East Africa, hoping for German support against the British, but this message was intercepted. On the night of Saturday, January 23, 1915, Chilembwe's followers gathered at the Providence Industrial Mission Church in Mbombwe. Chilembwe gave a speech that eyewitnesses later described. He told them that none of them should expect to survive the reprisals that would surely follow. He said the uprising would draw greater attention to their conditions and destabilize the colonial system, and he believed this was the only way change would ever occur. It was a remarkable moment. Here was a Baptist preacher who had been educated in America, who had built schools and churches, who had worked within the system for 15 years, essentially telling his congregation that martyrdom was the only path left. Then the groups dispersed to carry out their attacks. The main action took place at Magomero. Rebels moved toward the estate headquarters in the early evening of January 23rd, while William Jervis Livingstone and his wife Catherine were entertaining dinner guests. The estate official Duncan McCormick was in another nearby house. The attackers broke into the Livingstone house quietly and wounded Livingstone during hand-to-hand fighting. He retreated to a bedroom where his wife tried to treat his wounds, but the rebels forced their way in. They captured Catherine Livingston and then beheaded her husband. McCormick, alerted by the commotion, was killed by a rebel spear. The rebels took the women and children of the estate prisoner, but released them unharmed shortly afterward, having treated them well. Chilembwe had given explicit orders that women and children were not to be harmed, and his instructions were followed. The symbolism of Livingstone's killing was enormous. He was the manager who had destroyed Chilembwe's churches, who had enforced the brutal Thangata system, who had whipped and beaten workers, who represented everything oppressive about the colonial plantation economy. The next day, Sunday, January 24th, Chilembwe conducted a service at his church in Mbombwe. William Jervis Livingstone's head was displayed there as Chilembwe preached. The image is shocking and difficult, but it needs to be understood in context. For years, Africans had endured beatings, forced labor, starvation wages, the burning of their churches, the conscription of their young men. This was Chilembwe's way of saying that the violence of colonialism could no longer go unanswered. During the night of January 23rd to 24th, another group of rebels attacked the African Lakes Corporation's store in Blantyre and Limbe, hoping to capture weapons, but they were largely unsuccessful. They cut telephone lines to slow the spread of information. One small group of rebels did achieve a minor military success, ambushing a small party of King's African Rifles troops near Mbombwe on January 24th, which colonial reports described as the one reverse suffered by the government during the uprising. But overall, the rebellion failed almost immediately. Most of Chilembwe's lieutenants did not carry out their assigned attacks. The Ncheyu group under Chinyama never mobilized and moved south. There was no mass uprising of the African population. By the morning of January 24th, the colonial authorities had mustered the Nyasaland Volunteer Reserve, a unit of white settler militiamen, and redeployed regular troops from the King's African Rifles from the north of the colony. After a failed attack on Mbombwe on January 25th, during which Chilembwe remained inside his church praying while military leadership passed to David Kaduya, the rebels attacked and burned a Christian mission at Nguludi. The King's African Rifles and the volunteer force captured Mbombwe without resistance on January 26th. Chilembwe's impressive brick church was demolished by colonial authorities. Many of the rebels fled toward Portuguese Mozambique, hoping to reach safety across the border. Chilembwe was among them. On February 3, 1915, less than 2 weeks after the uprising began, he was shot and killed by an African police patrol near the border. He was probably around 43 or 44 years old. The colonial response was swift and brutal. About 40 rebels were executed after being convicted by tribunals. 300 more were imprisoned. Some of those executed were publicly hanged, their bodies left in the sun as warnings. The colonial authorities also engaged in collective punishment, burning huts and carrying out arbitrary acts of violence against the African population. Europeans were terrified. A commission of inquiry was convened in June 1915 to investigate the causes of the uprising. At the hearings, European planters blamed missionary activities for creating dangerous ideas among Africans. European missionaries emphasized the dangers of independent African churches like Chilembwe's that operated outside white control. Several Africans gave evidence about the brutal treatment of workers on estates, but they were largely ignored. The official inquiry blamed Chilembwe for mixing political and religious teaching, and it also blamed the harsh conditions on the Bruce estates and William Jervis Livingstone's unduly brutal regime. But while Livingstone was dead and could be scapegoated, Alexander Livingstone. Bruce escaped censure. even though he had been the one issuing orders from Magomero and serving on the governor's legislative council, where he represented the interests of large estate owners. After the uprising, Bruce successfully opposed any meaningful reforms to the plantation system. The Thangata labor obligations continued, sometimes amounting to 6 months per year. Bruce remained in control of the estate operations and on the legislative council. He died in Scotland in 1954. His company would go bankrupt in 1959, and Nyasaland would gain independence as Malawi in 1964. In the immediate aftermath, the colonial government tightened its grip. A new law required all churches registered in Nyasaland to have a white leader. This law remained in place until independence in 1964. Colonial officials promoted tribal loyalties through indirect rule, trying to prevent any unified African political consciousness. The Nyasaland police was restructured as a professional force of white settlers rather than conscripted Africans. Forced labor was retained and would remain a source of resentment for decades. For years after the uprising, former rebels were kept under police observation. The rebellion had local notoriety, but it seemed to have failed completely. 3 Europeans had died. 2 had been wounded. 36 convicted rebels had been executed, and many others had been killed by security forces. For a rebellion against foreign rule, it had been, as historians George Shepperson and Thomas Price noted, singularly ineffective in immediate, quantifiable terms. But the importance of the rising turned out to be far greater than its immediate impact. Over the next 3 decades, local anti-colonial activists began to idealize Chilembwe and see him as a semi-mythical figure. The Nyasaland African Congress in the 1940s and 50s used him as a symbolic figurehead. When the Congress announced its intention to mark February 15th annually as Chilembwe Day, colonial officials were scandalized. The very rebellion they had thought they suppressed had become a rallying point for the independence movement. In 1958, George Shepperson and Thomas Price published their comprehensive study titled Independent African, John Chilembwe, and the Origins, Setting, and Significance of the Nyasaland Native Uprising of 1915. The colonial government banned the book, but it was widely read among Nyasaland's educated class anyway. The book characterized Chilembwe's uprising as an early expression of Malawian nationalism. Chilembwe became viewed as what one historian called an unproblematic hero, someone whose courage and sacrifice could inspire the independence movement without the complications that came with some other historical figures. When Hastings Banda led the Malawi Congress Party to independence in 1964, he made a conscious effort to link himself to Chilembwe through speeches and radio broadcasts. In 1994, when Bakili Muluzi became president, he inaugurated a new national holiday on January 16th, Chilembwe Day. Chilembwe's portrait was added to Malawian currency, first on the kwacha notes and later on the 2000 kwacha note. Today, January 15th is observed annually as John Chilembwe Day in Malawi. His memory remains prominent in the collective national consciousness, invoked in political symbolism and rhetoric by politicians across the political spectrum. A statue of Chilembwe, titled Antelope, which is an English translation of his name, now stands in Trafalgar Square in London, placed there in 2022 as part of a series highlighting figures from Britain's imperial history. So what do we make of John Chilembwe? He doesn't fit the easy narratives we sometimes tell about colonialism. He wasn't fighting to preserve traditional ways against modernization. He embraced Western education, Christianity, and economic development. He wasn't opposed to Europeans in principle. He had been taught by British missionaries, educated in America, supported by African American churches, and he maintained friendships with some white missionaries throughout his life. The photograph, taken in 1914, showing Chilembwe standing next to British missionary John Chorley, both men wearing wide-brimmed hats in defiance of the colonial rule that forbade Africans from wearing hats in the presence of whites, shows two men who appear at ease with each other, colleagues and possibly friends. But Chilembwe was opposed to a system that claimed to be bringing civilization while actually bringing exploitation. He saw the contradiction at the heart of colonial rule. The British said they had ended the slave trade and brought Christianity and commerce, the famous 3 C's that David Livingstone had promised. But what they actually created was a system where Africans were forced to work for months at a time for little or no pay, on land that had been taken from them, producing crops for European profit. They said they were bringing education, but they burned down African schools. They said they were bringing law and order, but they whipped and beat workers with impunity. And when war came, they demanded that Africans die for them while continuing to deny them any rights or dignity. For years, Chilembwe tried to work within the system. He built schools and churches. He taught people to read and farm. He wrote letters to newspapers. He believed that demonstrating African capability and worthiness might change minds. But the system wasn't designed to change. It was designed to extract labor and profit from African bodies and African land. The burning of his churches in 1913, the conscription of his parishioners in 1914, the censoring of his letter, the plans to deport him, all of these were the system telling him that there was no place for an educated, dignified, independent African man in colonial Nyasaland. The only role available to him was submission. Chilembwe's decision to rebel, knowing that the rebellion would likely fail, is sometimes described as irrational or as evidence of psychological stress. He was in debt. His daughter had died. He suffered from asthma and failing eyesight. The famine of 1913 had pushed more desperate people toward his mission seeking help. All of this was real, but his decision also makes a different kind of sense. If the system will not change, if peaceful protest is censored, if education is burned, if your people are being worked to death and conscripted to die in a foreign war, then doing something, even something doomed, even something that will cost you your life, might be the only way to maintain your humanity. It might be the only way to say that you are not a thing to be used, but a person who can choose, even if that choice is to die fighting rather than live in subjection. The speech Chilembwe gave to his followers on the night of January 23rd is remarkable because of its honesty. He didn't promise them victory. He didn't claim divine intervention would save them. He told them they would probably die. But he also told them their deaths would draw attention to African suffering and destabilize the colonial system. He believed that bearing witness through action, even failed action, was the only path left. And he was right about one thing. The uprising did draw attention. It shocked the colonial authorities so thoroughly that they convened a formal inquiry. It created cracks in the facade of colonial control. And decades later, when Malawians sought symbols for their independence struggle, they looked back to Chilembwe. There's something else worth noting about Chilembwe's uprising. During the attack on Magomero, he gave explicit orders that women and children were not to be harmed, and those orders were followed. In an era when colonial violence against African women and children was routine, when forced labor killed thousands, when beatings and sexual exploitation were common, Chilembwe maintained limits even in rebellion. 3 adult men died in the uprising. That's 3 deaths too many. But compare that to the systematic violence of the colonial system, the deaths from overwork and malnutrition and abuse that accumulated year after year, and the moral accounting becomes more complex. The image that stays with people is that head displayed in Chilembwe's church. It's disturbing. It should be disturbing. But if we're disturbed by that, we should also be disturbed by the system that preceded it, by William Jervis Livingstone whipping workers on land stolen from their ancestors, by Alexander Livingstone Bruce sitting on the governor's legislative council while his employees beat and starved African tenants, by the entire apparatus of colonial extraction that treated human beings as disposable sources of labor. Chilembwe's violence was visible and shocking. Colonial violence was normalized and bureaucratic. Both were violence, but only one gets remembered as barbaric. Today, Chilembwe is celebrated in Malawi as a national hero and a father of independence. His face appears on currency. His birthday is a national holiday. Schoolchildren learn his story. The Providence Industrial Mission Church that Chilembwe founded was allowed to reorganize in 1926 under new leadership, and branches of it still exist today. Historians debate whether Chilembwe should be understood primarily as a religious figure, influenced by millennial expectations that World War I would bring the end of colonial rule, or as a secular nationalist trying to establish an independent African state, or as something in between. They debate whether his emphasis on African advancement through education and economic development showed the influence of Booker T. Washington, or whether his willingness to use violence echoed John Brown. They debate whether he planned carefully for the rebellion or acted impulsively when he learned of his pending deportation. But beyond the scholarly debates, Chilembwe represents something simpler and more profound. He represents the idea that there are some things worth dying for, that human dignity matters more than survival, that a system based on exploitation and racism is not inevitable or natural, but is something that can and should be resisted, that an educated Christian minister could look at colonialism and decide that the most Christian thing to do was not to preach patience and submission, but to strike a blow, even a doomed blow, for justice. The rebellion failed in its immediate objectives. Chilembwe died less than 2 weeks after it began, shot by a police patrol as he tried to flee across the border into Mozambique. His church was demolished. His followers were executed or imprisoned. The colonial system continued. But the memory of what he did continued too. It continued through the decades of continued colonial rule, through the independence struggle, through the establishment of modern Malawi. It continues today when people look at his face on their money or observe Chilembwe Day each January. John Chilembwe was born into a world shaped by slavery and colonialism. His mother may have been enslaved. He grew up amid violence and insecurity. The British arrived promising civilization and instead brought a different form of exploitation. But Chilembwe refused to accept that exploitation as inevitable. He educated himself. He went to America and learned what freedom looked like. He came back and built schools and churches. He wrote letters and preached sermons. And when all of that proved insufficient, when the system made clear that there was no place for an educated, independent, dignified African man, he made a choice. he chose to fight. He chose to die rather than submit. And in making that choice, he became something more than a Baptist preacher from a small village in Nyasaland. He became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that the oppressed can strike back, that no system of oppression is so total that people cannot choose to defy it. Over a century after his death, we still tell his story. We tell it because it matters. Because John Chilembwe's life illuminates something essential about colonialism, about dignity, about resistance, and about the human capacity to choose justice even when justice seems impossible. His uprising lasted less than 2 weeks. His legacy has lasted more than a century. And the question he posed to his followers on that Saturday night in January 1915, the question of whether it is better to strike a blow and die than to live in subjection, remains one that echoes through history. Chilembwe answered that question with his life, and Malawi answered it with independence. His choice, his sacrifice, and his memory remind us that even in the darkest systems, even when victory seems impossible, people can choose to stand up, to fight back, and to refuse to accept their own oppression. That refusal, more than any immediate victory or defeat, is what changes history.